New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
They always get praised for being so green.
Yeah.
They get over 80% of their electricity from renewables,
Wow.
mostly hydro and geothermal, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is.
But when you look at their transport and their industries,
Right.
they're still pretty hooked on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So how does a country that's so far ahead in one area tackle those trickier sectors? I mean, it's a puzzle.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're diving into today. But we're not just theorizing. We're actually basing this deep dive on a specific research paper.
We are.
It's called Gulaje 2025 Paper Analyzing Techno Econ Impacts, Indic Wave Power Achieve, Carbon Neutrality Fuels Exports, NZGY Final.pdf.
That's the one.
Catchy title, right?
Yeah.
But it's essentially a really in-depth analysis of how New Zealand could potentially become carbon neutral by 2050.
That's the big question.
So for our listeners today, what should they be listening for? What are the key takeaways from this paper?
Well, we want to give everyone a clear understanding of the main findings. You know, cut through all the technical jargon and really highlight what matters most.
Yeah.
So think of this as your shortcut to understanding New Zealand's energy future
Okay.
and the role that a perhaps surprising renewable energy source could play. Wave power.
Wave power.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I mean, New Zealand is an island nation,
Exactly.
but is there really enough wave energy there to make a real difference?
That's a great question, and that's what this paper digs into.
Okay.
It analyzes the techno-economic impacts. That means the feasibility and the costs of incorporating wave power into their energy system
Okay.
to achieve not just carbon neutrality, but also potentially to export electricity-based fuels, what we call e-fuels.
E-fuels, all right.
Now, to do this, the researchers use a sophisticated modeling tool called EP-Allison-Lute.
E-Palace-and-Lute.
Yeah, it's a program designed to simulate different energy scenarios for 2030 and 2050.
2030 and 2050, okay?
Yeah.
So they're looking ahead.
Long-term thinking.
As we focus on this paper, what are some of the big takeaways? Like, what surprised you?
Well, one of the most interesting things is that while New Zealand has incredible wave power potential,
They do.
the model suggests that if you're purely looking at minimizing costs up front,
Okay.
wave power might not be the very first technology to get adopted widely.
Interesting.
Things like solar PV and wind power,
Yeah.
they seem to be more cost-effective at the outset.
Right. I guess the bottom line often drives those early decisions.
It often does.
But I'm guessing this report goes beyond just the initial price tag, right?
You're absolutely right, it does.
Okay.
The paper shows that even when they included wave power and they looked at adding up to 2,000 megawatts of it,
It's 2,000. Wow.
the total annual cost for the whole energy system,
Okay.
it only went up a tiny bit, like less than 2%.
So a small increase for a potentially big payoff.
Yeah, and the paper highlights some really interesting advantages that come with that small cost bump. Plus, there's the whole idea of New Zealand producing and exporting e-fuels to the Pacific Islands.
Oh, interesting.
That's a whole other exciting aspect they explore.
Definitely intriguing.
Okay, so to dive in, we need to start with the basics, like where is New Zealand at right now with their energy?
Right. We mentioned they have a high renewable share in electricity.
They do. Over 80% comes from renewables, mostly hydro and geothermal.
Impressive.
Yeah, they've done a lot already to green their electricity supply.
But they also have this zero carbon bill aiming for net zero emissions by 2050.
Yes.
And this paper is looking at the entire energy system, not just electricity.
Exactly, and that's where things get more complex.
Right.
The zero carbon bill aims for net zero across all sectors
Okay.
by 2050, except for biogenic methane from agriculture.
So there's an exception for that.
Right, and that's a big challenge because while their electricity is pretty clean,
Uh-huh.
transport and industry are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels.
Yeah, I guess it's always harder to decarbonize those sectors. So they've got this great foundation with renewable electricity,
They do.
but the rest is still pretty fossil fuel dependent.
Yeah.
So what other renewable resources does New Zealand have, according to this paper? Can they really just scale up hydro and geothermal and be done?
Well, no, luckily they have a lot more than just that.
Okay, good.
The paper points out they have a huge potential for solar PV, over 2,000 gigawatts peak.
2,000 gigawatts, that's massive.
It is, and peak refers to the maximum output under ideal conditions.
So best case scenario.
Right, but it shows the potential.
Yeah.
They also have a lot of potential for onshore wind, about 90 gigawatts.
Okay.
and an even bigger potential for offshore wind, like 2,250 gigawatts.
Wow, those are some big numbers.
And of course, there's wave power estimated at around 1,900 gigawatts.
1,900 gigawatts of wave power. That's really impressive.
It is, and those are just potential numbers. Their current installed capacity is around 10 gigawatts.
10 gigawatts, so much room to grow. This paper is basically saying they have the resources to fully ditch fossil fuels by 2050
That's the idea.
and even produce e-hydrogen and e-fuels,
Yeah,
both for themselves and for export.
that's right.
All right, so let's dig into the wave power aspect.
Let's do it.
You mentioned it has huge potential.
Yeah.
What makes New Zealand such a good spot for wave energy?
Well, globally, wave power is recognized as a huge untapped resource.
Okay.
Everyone agrees on that, though the exact potential varies.
Right.
What this paper highlights about New Zealand is that they have excellent wave conditions and very high full load hours.
Okay, back up. What are full load hours?
Think of it like this. It's a measure of how consistently a power plant can operate at its max capacity
Okay.
over a year.
So the higher the number, the more reliable a source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And New Zealand has around 7,100 full load hours for wave power.
7,100. Is that good?
It's very good. It's higher than places like the British Isles or South Africa.
So their waves are pretty consistent.
Very consistent.
So if they have this great potential, this reliable wave energy,
Yeah.
why does the paper say it might not be the most cost-effective option at first?
Well, that's what their cost optimization analysis looked at.
Right.
Their model basically found that solar PV and wind power are more competitive on cost right now in New Zealand.
Oh.
So if you want the absolute cheapest transition, you'd go with those first.
Makes sense.
But, and this is important,
Okay.
even when they added wave power to the model, up to 2,000 megawatts,
Okay.
the total annual cost only increased by a small amount, between 0.9% and 1.7%.
Okay, so not a huge jump.
Not at all.
So what are the benefits then? Why even bother with wave power if it costs a bit more?
Well, the paper points out a couple of key things.
Okay.
First, it diversifies your technology.
Okay.
If you rely on a bunch of different renewable sources,
Yeah.
including wave power, your system becomes more resilient.
Okay, I see. Less vulnerable.
Exactly. Because if one technology has problems, you have others to back it up.
Hmm.
The second thing is that wave power can actually reduce how much solar PV you need.
Oh, interesting.
Because solar is intermittent, you often need a lot of battery storage.
To smooth things out, yeah.
Right. But wave power is more consistent,
Okay.
so you need less storage.
So it creates a more balanced system overall.
Exactly. That's the idea.
All right, let's move on to the different scenarios the paper looked at.
Yeah.
What were those?
So they had MY 2030,
MY 2030.
which focused on decarbonizing the power sector by 2030.
Makes sense.
Then there's RE 2050,
Okay.
which models a completely net zero renewable energy system by 2050.
Ambitious.
And lastly, there's RE 2050 EE,
RE 2050 EA.
which builds on the net zero goal and looks at e-fuel exports.
So each scenario builds on the last.
That's right.
You mentioned a greenfield approach.
I did.
What does that mean in this context?
Imagine designing the perfect energy system from scratch
Okay.
for 2030 and 2050.
A blank slate.
Exactly. The model isn't limited by existing infrastructure.
Makes sense.
It figures out the best mix of new technologies
Okay.
to meet future demand.
Got it.
Now, they did consider the lifespan of some existing assets like onshore wind and pumped hydro.
Oh, so they weren't completely ignoring the current system.
No, they factored that in for 2050.
Okay, that makes sense.
So speaking of demand, how much electricity do they think New Zealand will need in these scenarios?
Yeah, with all these changes.
They're predicting a big increase, mostly because of electrification.
So transport, heating, industry, all going electric.
Right, and by 2030, demand is projected to be 2.5 times higher than in 2020.
Wow, 2.5 times.
And by 2050, it could be almost 5 times higher.
That's a massive increase.
It is.
So which technologies are going to step up and meet this demand?
In their cost-optimized scenarios, solar PV really takes the lead.
Solar PV.
Yeah, it often makes up about 80% of the total installed capacity.
Okay.
And the model favors single-axis tracking PV systems.
Single axis tracking, remind me what that is.
Those are the panels that move with the sun throughout the day.
Right, to maximize their output.
Exactly.
What about hydro and geothermal?
They still play a role, but they don't see as much growth as solar and wind.
Interesting.
It's really about scaling up those newer technologies.
Okay, so what happens when they specifically add wave power to the mix?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
They found that adding wave power actually reduces the need for both single-axis tracking and fixed-tilt solar PV.
So it's substituting for solar.
Exactly. And to give you an example,
Okay.
in the MY 2030 scenario, adding 2 gigawatts of wave power reduced the required single-axis tracking PV capacity by 8.7 gigawatts peak.
8.7 gigawatts. That's substantial.
It is.
So wave power really can replace a lot of solar.
According to the model, yes.
And what else happens when they add wave power?
Well, a few things.
Okay.
The total electricity generation goes down slightly.
Really?
Yeah. And there's less excess electricity, what we call curtailment.
Curtailment, right, when you have to waste renewable energy because there's no demand or storage.
Exactly.
You know?
And as you add more wave power, it makes up a bigger chunk of the total generation.
So its contribution grows.
Right. In the MY 2030 scenario, with 2,000 megawatts of wave power, it provides over 13% of the electricity.
That's significant, especially considering it wasn't the cheapest at first.
It's a really interesting trade-off.
It is.
Now, when you have all these variable renewables, like solar and wind,
Yeah.
you need a lot of energy storage and grid flexibility.
Absolutely, to balance things out.
Right. And this paper looked at a few different options.
Okay, which ones?
They looked at stationary batteries,
Uh-huh.
vehicle to grid, that's where electric vehicles can feed power back to the grid,
Oh, interesting.
pumped hydro energy storage,
Right.
and hydrogen storage.
They have a good range of technologies.
They wanted to see how much storage would be needed.
Yeah.
And what they found is that the more variable renewables you have,
Uh-huh.
the more storage you need. No surprise there.
Makes sense.
But what's interesting is that hydrogen storage ended up being the biggest in their cost-optimized scenarios.
Really? Why is that?
Oh, they explain that it's mainly because they're using it to produce those e-fuels for export.
Oh, right, not just for balancing the grid.
Exactly.
So what about balancing the grid then? Like when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing?
That's where stationary batteries and pumped hydro come in.
Okay.
But here's the key thing about wave power.
Okay.
Adding wave power actually reduces how much of all those storage technologies you need.
So hydrogen storage, pumped hydro, batteries, all of them.
All of them.
Wow, how does that work?
Because wave power is more consistent and predictable.
Okay.
It helps smooth out the variability from solar and wind.
I see, so less fluctuation overall.
Exactly. And the paper even gives specific numbers for how much less storage you need depending on the amount of wave power.
That's really interesting.
It's not just about generating electricity, it's about making the whole system work better.
I'm seeing that. All right, let's talk about costs now.
Okay.
You said the total annual cost peaks around 2030 and then goes down. Why is that?
Well, the paper says it's because of the huge investments needed up front.
So to build all those new renewable plants and storage.
Yeah, that initial cost is higher than what they're paying now and higher than what they'd pay in 2050 with a fully renewable system.
So it's a big hump to get over.
It is, but once you've built everything,
Yeah.
the operating costs of renewables are so much lower than fossil fuels.
So it pays off in the long run.
That's the idea.
What about the levelized cost of energy?
It follows the same trend.
So up in 2030, down in 2050?
Yep, ending up lower than today's costs.
Yeah, it's good to hear.
And remember, wave power only adds a small amount to the total cost,
Right. It's still a pretty good option overall.
especially when you consider those other benefits.
Okay, let's talk about e-fuel exports.
All right.
This paper explores the idea of New Zealand sending e-fuels to the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, those islands often struggle to develop their own large-scale renewables.
Right, limited space and resources.
So exactly, and they rely heavily on imported fossil fuels.
Especially for things like shipping. Yeah, it's a big problem for them.
So how much demand for e-fuels is there in the Pacific Islands?
The paper estimates the total demand for liquid e-fuels by 2050,
Okay.
including e-diesel, e-kerosene for jets, and e-methanol, to be around 12.4 terawatt hours per year.
12.4 terawatt hours.
Okay. That's a lot of e-fuel.
It is.
And to meet that demand, on top of their own needs,
Yeah.
New Zealand would need an extra 17.1 gigawatts of renewable capacity.
17.1 gigawatts, that's on top of everything else they need to build.
Yeah, it's a significant undertaking.
What about the cost for New Zealand?
Well, it does increase their total energy system cost by about 9–10%.
Okay, so not a tiny amount.
And the levelized cost of energy goes up a bit too.
But there are benefits, right?
Absolutely.
Like what?
It's a huge opportunity for New Zealand's economy.
How so?
It would boost their trade balance and create new jobs.
Okay, makes sense.
And for the Pacific Islands, it gives them a more sustainable energy source.
Yeah, and less reliance on those expensive fossil fuel imports.
So it's a win-win, but a big investment.
Right, it requires careful planning.
Definitely.
So overall, what does this paper tell us?
Yeah, what are the key takeaways?
Well, the main one is that New Zealand can achieve net zero emissions by 2050
They can.
using a mix of renewable technologies.
This paper specifically highlighted the role of wave power.
Right. It did, even though it might not be the absolute cheapest option at first.
Yeah.
It brings a lot of benefits in terms of diversity and resilience.
And it doesn't add that much to the overall cost.
Right. It's a trade-off worth considering.
Absolutely.
The paper also emphasizes just how much new infrastructure they'll need.
Yeah, we talked about those huge capacity increases.
It's a massive build-out, but the good news is that by 2050,
Yeah.
they're projected to have lower energy costs than they do today.
So the future looks bright, at least in terms of cost.
It does.
And then there's the whole e-fuel export potential.
Right. New Zealand could become a key supplier in the region.
That's a big opportunity.
It is.
The paper did mention some limitations, though, right?
They did. They acknowledged that their model simplifies the electricity transmission system.
Okay, so it doesn't capture all the complexities of the grid.
Exactly.
So there's more research to be done there.
There is, but it's still a valuable analysis.
Absolutely.
So to sum up, this paper shows that wave power could be a key part of New Zealand's energy future.
Even if it's not the cheapest option right now.
Right. It's about thinking long-term and considering all the benefits.
I like that it's not just about the bottom line.
It's about creating a sustainable and resilient system.
Exactly.
And maybe even helping out their neighbors in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's a really compelling vision.
It is.
It really makes you think, how much should countries be willing to pay for energy independence and diversity?
That's a big question.
And what are the implications if places like New Zealand become major e-fuel exporters?
It changes the whole geopolitical landscape.
It really does.
It's fascinating to think about.
It is. And that's what these deep dives are all about.
Yeah, getting people thinking critically about these complex issues.
Exactly. So for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more,
Yes.
I encourage you to check out the Gulaji 2025 paper.
It's full of interesting details.
Or do some research on wave-powered technology and the energy challenges facing island nations.
It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.